for his impact. He was a scholar, a literary scholar of the highest caliber. He was educated on the classics in all the original languages and maintained a wide and voracious reading throughout his entire lifetime. We know from his letters in his early years, even in his teenage years, he already was someone that was diligent in thinking about thinking. He categorized the history of his own life and that of his friendships according to different stages of thought development, not according to dates. And furthermore, Lewis had an immense power of recollection. Tolkien once commented to a student of Lewis's saying, "You will never get to the bottom of him." What a compliment. I'm too old to get to that stage, but I appreciate that it was said of Lewis. You'll never get to the bottom of it. And Lewis genuinely loved the exchange of ideas, the arena where reason was not owned by anyone. It was free and wild and untamed, and no one could quite tell where it was going to go. And though Lewis's geographic travels were not much to speak of, his literary adventures were unparalleled. Lewis had a reader's passport, and he used it so extensively that though he saw little beyond Ireland and England, he knew the ethos, the vibe, the Sitzemleben of 1,000 lands, and especially their wonder, their beauty, their longing, their imagination. Part of why he is so loved by so many is because Lewis spoke fluently the language that we all share. Imaginative language. But Lewis certainly was a lover of reason. Probably what was his most formative years of education as a young atheist, which I don't know if you know that's what he was. He was an atheist for the first half of his life. As a young atheist, came under the tutelage of a man named William Kirkpatrick, who had been his father's tutor, who Lewis referred to as Old Kronos, the cold logician who he felt would have been a logical positivist if it had just gone a bit further. If you don't know what logical positivism is, thankfully it is now relegated to the annals of the history of philosophy, but it was a philosophy, really an epistemology in the early 20th century, wherein only empirical things can be held as true. And by that, every statement of value and beauty and merit and love and faith becomes meaningless. At best, something you can play games with language. Only the empirical matters. And that has since become defunct. But this is who Lewis spends formative time in his adolescence underneath, and he does this away from his peers. It is a crucible of education, and Lewis absolutely thrives in it. In fact, in one of his autobiographical works, he says how he feigned to his father, well, I think I'll just bear up underneath it. But inwardly, he said it was like beef and strong beer to him. He just absolutely thrived on it. Not on the campus, though. And so this is how Lewis goes on. And entire volumes have been written about Lewis's reason, his love of reason, even the certitude that it conveys. Tandy put out volume 2009 called The Rhetoric of Certitude, all about this precise, these dichotomies and trichotomies and rigid rational arguments that Lewis presents that convey this ethos of this certitude that goes on. Owen Barfield's, Lewis's dear friend, an intellectual reparteur, referred in a lecture in the 1970s at the Wade Center, he described Lewis's thinking as, quote, eminently atomic. Not atomic like, though that would be a good adjective too. Eminently atomic in terms of that small, so refined, so clear, so precise. Eminently atomic. And this love for and brilliant application of reason is what largely endears Lewis to so many apologists today. Great figures like our own who teaches here, William Lane Craig, credit C.S. Lewis as an inspiration to their own apologetic methodology. But what I want to argue and what I want you to know is that that's not who Lewis was. Well, that's not merely who Lewis was, and not by a long way. You see, from a young age, Lewis's love of reason became bifurcated from his imagination, and his very real and intense love for both and the inability to reconcile them for the first half of his life produced in Lewis a terrible mental and emotional discord. He describes those younger years in this way. He says, the only two kinds of talk that I wanted were the almost purely imaginative or the almost purely rational. The tension between the mechanistic pursuit of the purely rational and the alluring draw of the imaginative created in Lewis a dichotomy, a sharp dichotomy that for years, for decades, seemed irreconcilable. He writes famously this: the two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and of myth, and on the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary, and nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. In Spirits in Bondage, which is an early book of poetry, as Dr. Marcos rightly said, Lewis's early desire and love for his lifetime was to be a poet. He failed at this early on. This first volume of Spirits in Bondage, when he writes as an atheist, during this time, it conveys, if you read that poetry, it conveys, which you can usually get free on Kindle or nearly free, so go remedy that if you don't have it, remedies this inner tension and this dichotomy between his imagination and his reason comes out in how he's relating to God in a very caustic worldview. In his letters during this time to his dear childhood friend, Arthur Greaves, he says this: nature is wholly, entirely diabolical and malevolent, and that God, if he exists, is outside of and in opposition to the cosmic arrangements. Now, in my own journey, in my years younger as an agnostic, later as a Christian, as a pastor and missionary and professor and all these things, and in my own life and with many, many others, I have seen this similar wrestling of the reason and the imagination, where all the rational argumentation is there, but simply doesn't make the difference. And this is not just among atheists, it's among all sorts. But it is telling. In a very recent book that just came out called Atheists Finding God, Jana Harmon chronicles her PhD work, where she takes her research of interviewing 50 different, or conducting interviews of 50 different conversion stories. And through all the interviews, this is one of the summary statements that she makes. She says, no matter the substance of the arguments and the evidence presented, disbelief and doubt seemingly persist. The best theistic arguments, evidence, and writings appear to increasingly fall upon deaf ears, surrounded by ever-increasing cultural ridicule. In other words, the purely rational is not enough on its own. Analytic and rational argumentation, and hear me clearly, though very needed and immensely valuable. This is not a lecture against that. Though very needed and immensely valuable, it ignores and lacks a great deal of what it means to be human. For many today, truth, it's no longer a modernist notion of rationally coherent, internally consistent, logical premises. Rather, truth is what proves to be life-giving and good for one's community, for one's circle. And however incomplete or misguided that sense of truth may become in practice, it really is more holistic, because it speaks also to the inner person, where one is wounded, scarred, scared, where the winds of wonder have fallen still, and the boughs no longer blow in the breeze, and the clouds no longer float by. And it is precisely that wonder that we need to call back to mind when we would think of Christ and speak of him to others. As Chesterton wrote, the world will never want for wonder or for wonders, only for wonder. Now, we do have apologists in our time today who are doing really great and meaningful work in this area. And I want to try to line out a bit of a spectrum, but first let me step away from the dangerous precipice, because on one end we would have sort of extreme examples following out of Derrida and a sort of a postmodern epistemology. An example of this would be Myron Penner's The End of Apologetics, wherein he calls for the complete abandonment of all modern apologetics because he views them as inherently flawed for being based upon an Enlightenment modernist epistemology. And I don't really agree with that at all, though some of his insights I think are very helpful. The abandonment of this altogether is not really the answer. So if we draw back the spectrum a bit from there, we do have others doing very meaningful work in this way. We have two leaders connected to the School of Christian Thought here at HCU, being Dr. Michael Ward, who was recently in town, and Dr. Holly Ordway, both doing excellent work in this areas. But I would argue that the signal fires of Gondor need to keep being lit, okay? And so if I can keep playing off of our dear Lord of the Rings, so in a sense I'm suggesting there's a spectrum, the two towers of apologetics, spanning from the purely rational to the imaginative. And both of these can really be seen in one event. On the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, he was honored by being memorialized at Poets' Corner, Westminster, a beautiful posthumous nod to the man who always wanted to be a poet. And so in our own Dr. Ward sort of oversaw that event, and so he was there. And now the panel discussion, which is recorded in a book called C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner, the panel discussion included, among others, theologian and apologist Dr. Judith Wool from St. Andrews, and philosopher and apologist Dr. William Lane Craig. And Dr. Craig celebrated Lewis's advocacy of reason and clarity, even crediting Lewis, again, as an inspiration to his own approach to apologetics. And that is high praise. In our day, I mean, William Lane Craig's body of work is absolutely phenomenal. And not only that, but for me personally, the man has maintained his integrity, and he has, in his character, I think, represented Christ well for decades. He's debated everybody since I was a little kid. And so it's very high praise coming from Dr. Craig. But I think that Dr. Wolf's observation better encompasses Lewis's entire approach. She said this: I think that this approach to apologetics, not starting from prepackaged, abstract, nicely arranged rational arguments, but rather from attentiveness to the full range of what makes us human, and seeing what view of the world can accommodate that, is something that we should emulate as apologists, and indeed as Christians more generally. And I agree with her. Where Craig understandably extols the clarity and precision of Lewis's use of reason, Wolf's assessment recognized that in C.S. Lewis, we have an apologetic methodology that does not fit neatly into strict, precision-based approaches, and furthermore offers a broader conceptual engagement of the entire human experience and all its distractions. I'll tell you a quick funny story. I don't want to eat up into the Q&A time, but you guys will get a kick out of this. When I went to Hungary, I refused to teach until I could do it in Hungarian. Okay? It was just a conviction I had as missionary guy, and because I felt like if I want to speak English, I'll just stay in America, save everybody a lot of money. So I waited. It took me 3.5 years until I could do it. And my good friend, Kisha Andrea, which I hope is listening, Andrew in English, my friend Andrea, he invited me to preach at his church, which he had to start in a somewhat illicit way within the denomination he was a part of, and it was in a pub in downtown Budapest. So I was preaching my first sermon there in a foreign language, and it was Pentecost Sunday. It was fantastic bit of humor. God's got the best sense of humor. And the folks that rambled down in the midst of the pub on a Sunday morning to see a bunch of people talking about Jesus, it was fantastic. So celebrate your interruptions. All right. So this thing of Lewis having a broader conceptual engagement of what it means, of the entire human experience, this aligns with what we see from Doctors Ward and Ordway, Davison, even parts of what we get out of folks like Gabelin and Penner. It's inviting the imagination to consider additional possibilities and alternatives. And that is an approach in which fertile, positive ambiguity can grow. I won't go too far into that because it actually goes into my doctoral research, which I'm trying to stay away from for my own sanity. But within Lewis and others, there is a kind of ambiguity that functions as a rhetorical device in its own right, helping to pass by secondary areas of contention. Let them lay silent, keep those gates closed, in order to keep a primary aim and focus and journey towards that vista, to see that viewpoint. Owen Barfield, in that same lecture where Lewis is so eminently atomic, or speaking at the same location, he also said this, that C.S. Lewis had within him this loving impulse to protect and insulate imagination so that it could continue to live in its own pure and chaste life, to insulate it, therefore, from having anything whatever to do with fact. Quite a quote. So Lewis was undeniably a lover of both reason and imagination. But how did these come together? How did they unite in his thinking and thereby influence his writing, including his apologetic works? Now, let me say this out front. If you haven't read much Lewis, you need to know that Lewis had a penchant for idiosyncratically defining terms and then using them in a technical way. Taking a word, giving it kind of his own definition, and then using it based on that, okay? And if you miss that, if you fail to understand this or read Lewis too narrowly, like so many disagreements today, what happens is definitions are assumed, but they are not agreed upon. And the differences, which are often significant, continue to pester the discussion, and no one quite understands why we're not making any progress. Often with Lewis, there are those who are taking issue and arguing with Lewis, but they're not actually arguing with him, they're arguing with their misreading of him, unknowingly. And not just with Lewis, this happens with all kinds of people. I hear it sometimes happens on social media, but I don't know. So, the importance of Lewis's understanding of the the workings and the interrelation of imagination and reason, I believe, can hardly be overstated of how significant this is in his life. It was the foundation of his hermeneutic, though given the progress of when that comes into parlance, that might not have been his term, but posthumously, it was the foundation of his hermeneutic. It's mirrored in his conversion. It is pervasive in his apologetic works, and again, it is intrinsically imbued with ambiguity. The clearest statement that we get about this from Lewis comes from an essay that he gave in 1939 called Bluspells and Phalansphers, a Semantic Nightmare. It's a fascinating one. And what he does in this essay is he takes metaphors whose original referent and intent have been lost because of the passage of time. But the metaphor itself is continuing to be used, right? But its original reference is no longer there. And so he's exploring, well, what kind of importance and meaning can this metaphor still have? And he starts with very rational things and ends up with these terms, Bluspells and Phalansphers. I'll leave it to you to go read and see how he makes that journey. But as he's working through this, he makes this statement. He says, for me, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Imagination is the gateway to all understanding and the diviner of meaning. It is imagination that suggests to us in a mysterious or even mystical way that a thing may carry some meaning. And imagination may then deliver this to the purview of reason, which operates upon it to determine what corresponds to reality. The imagination's function in perceiving meaning becomes the vehicle by which concepts are delivered to the reason for validation as true or false. Reason is the safeguard. It is the guardrail that protects against just unfettered imagination. As Michael Ward notes, it distinguishes between, quote, things that mean falsely and things that mean truly, between erroneous meaning and correct meaning. And though the operation of reason is conscious, in Lewis's real economy of meaning, the sub-rational or the lower workings of imagination are primary. Before anything can be known as true or false, it must somehow mean. One must pass through the land of imagination before ever crossing the borders of truth. This is why Lewis can declare that meaning is the antecedent condition of both truth and falsehood, whose antithesis is not error, but falsehood. Now, this juxtaposition between meaning and falsehood, as opposed to meaning and error, can be better understood by yet another idiosyncrasy in Lewis, dealing with the imaginary versus the imaginative. Now, the imaginary with Lewis is false. It is the same as sort of make-believe. One journeys with the imaginary only by a kind of pretending, choosing to suspend admission of the obvious falsehood. And the more blatantly imaginary a thing is, the, quote, nearer to admitting its falsity. The imaginary, in fact, may suggest things that are ultimately unknowable or unreal. And in that way, kind of introduces a danger where one can confuse the realization of unknowing as though actually knowing something. So where with Lewis, the imaginary is negative, portraying falsehood, but the imaginative is positive, drawing the reader into the spiritual world that it inhabits. He says, quote, it communicates more reality to us. The organ of imagination reaches out toward a thing that may be anchored in some corresponding reality, engaging the narrative so that reason may eventually evaluate its merits. And a successful discovery of meaning by the imagination should result in what is truly an integrated, holistic accommodation, or as Ward elsewhere delineates, a complete, unimpaired, healthy, fruitful psychophysical relationship. It is holistic. It is integrated. And this is only achieved with imagination when there is the corresponding function of a healthy reason. Now, in the later Lewis, imagination and reason are resolved. They are symbiotic and they are significantly heuristic. But for many years, nearly half his life, the relationship between them created great inner discord. Malcolm Guy draws this out using the very poem that Dr. Marcos works with, where Lewis is again wrestling between what he could prove philosophically and what he apprehended with his imagination. And in that poem, which was published posthumously by the dear late Walter Hooper, and he gave it the title Reason, originally it had no title. In the reprinting of the critical edition of Lewis's poetry by Don King, he leaves it untitled, which is very just, but makes it hard to reference. So it gets referenced as Reason, and Malcolm Guy thinks this poem may be as early as 1925. I think that's very reasonable, but certainly the poem is written before Lewis's conversion to theism. He doesn't go from atheism right to Christianity. He crosses some bases along the way, kind of an infield home run. So what would later become the natural organ of truth and the organ of meaning, they are personified in that poem. The earlier poem, again, represents, as Lewis writes it, Athene is reason and Demeter is imagination. And they are wrapped in a metaphor of Lewis's own soul, the Athenian Acropolis, the Acropolis, the city up top there. They, again, are maid and mother. Each must be given their due. Tempt not Athene. Wound not Demeter. Demeter possesses her mother right. She is warm, dark, obscure, and infinite. This poem, I believe, prefigures the very language that Lewis uses 30 years later in what is probably his greatest work, Till We Have Faces, his imaginative retelling of the story of Cupid and Psyche. And in that, he has a figure who is the priest, not really the best character in terms of moral quality, and he's juxtaposed with the fox. And the fox is the Stoic philosopher who presents a prattle of maxims and sort of indoctrinates. But the priest, when he speaks, he says that holy wisdom is, quote, thick and dark like blood, giving life and strength, not mere knowledge and words. Back to the poem, Lewis speaks again of imagination's dim, exploring touch. And though not yet fully formed at that time, what I think we see here is what I like to refer to as the imaginative reach. It is there, an imaginative reach. It is unclear, it is adventurous, it is perhaps dangerous and mysterious and intended to bring forth life. But Athene and Demeter were not yet in harmony for this younger Lewis. He yearned to see them unified, to bring him finally onto harmonious shores where imagination and reason end in a kind of faith. Again, the ending. Who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? Who will make in me a concord of the depth and the height? Who make imagination's dim, exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight? Then I could truly say, and not deceive, then wholly say that I believe, which I think should have been the title of the poem, I believe. That's where but there are better minds than mine at work there. The reconciliation of imagination and reason that eluded Lewis would eventually come, and it would be in his conversion to Christianity. Now, an important precursor here, much in his teenage years, was his reading of MacDonald's Fantasies, where Lewis recalls that it transformed his relationship to another idiosyncratic thing in Lewis, which is his joy. This is a massive area in Lewis and the other big thing for me, but it was essentially it helped, how do I describe this? It's an elusive longing for a longing, a rapturous sense of something wholly other, a place, an existence, a beauty that then is lost when you try to contemplate it. And Fantasies helped Lewis, helped those moments of joy for Lewis to not be so fleeting. It did bring his reason and his imagination a bit closer together. And he writes of reading it saying, in the depths of my disgraces, in the then invincible ignorance of my intellect. That's the thing you only say about yourself after a little bit of time. In the then invincible ignorance of my intellect, all of this was given me without asking, even without consent. That night, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. And the rest of me, not unnaturally, took a little bit longer. And that's very English there. So the organ of meaning, imagination, was first unto the breach. Reason comes along later. And it's helpful here, I think, to even reflect. Michael Ward expresses what I think is a three-tiered experiential hierarchy for Lewis's Christianity. There's the sub-rational imagination, the rational reason, and the supra-rational, a sort of divine grace. This is reflected in Lewis's conversion, which finally brings the two together. The key event, of course, famously, is his late-night conversation with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. And in Lewis's October 18 letter of 1931, we read, and when he writes to his friend Arthur Greaves again, Lewis had been struggling with the doctrinal implications of the redemption. Rational uncertainty about the doctrine related to present day had Lewis at an impasse, an intellectual impasse. Now, conversely, Lewis found that he was, quote, mysteriously moved by the pagan myths of the dying and rising gods, Bacchus and Balder and Adonis. And he had no problem accepting those as, quote, profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in prose what it meant. Tolkien and Dyson helped Lewis, my interpretation, see that he had an inconsistent hermeneutic, suggesting that Lewis embraced the Gospels, read the Gospels, much in the same way he had been reading the pagan myths, with the exception that with Christ he had the true myth. Somebody in here wrote a book about that. Okay. Lewis had been approaching Christianity via reason apart from imagination. But with pagan myths, he had allowed his imagination to have its dim, exploring touch, the imaginative reach. By allowing his imagination to take its proper place in relationship to the Gospels, Lewis moved not beyond doctrine, but through it, back to that which the doctrine is about. Ward, I love this thing. I had to use it. Says he moved from an analytic to a religious perspective in the literal sense, from loosening up to tying back up, religio, back to a religious perspective. Beautiful. The result was an embrace of Christianity as the true myth that is to be approached in much the same way as the pagan myths, and raises up out of paganism that which is true. And then, one of my most famous quotes, Lewis writes this: "We must not, in a false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to be mythopoeic, communicating in myth, if God chooses to be mythopoeic, and is not the sky itself a myth?" What's he talking about? Psalm 19. The heavens declare. Is not the sky itself a myth? Shall we refuse to be mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and our delight, addressed to the savage, the child, the poet in each of us, no less than to the moralist and the scholar and the philosopher. It is an imaginative reach, sub-rationally grasping at what has piqued imagination's wonder. It is the imagination that allows one to sense connections and relations that, once verified by reason, make sense of our world, of one another, and even our own selves. Meaning pre-exists truth or falsehood, determinations of truth or falsehood. Reason is the natural organ for making those determinations. But awareness of potential meaning must first take place. As McGrath states, Lewis's explicit appeal to reason involves an implicit appeal to imagination. A significant part of this is why Ward makes the argument that apologetic language benefits from being vivid, and having sensory and chosen with poetic, not just abstractly rational content. It employs a kind of ambiguous outcome. And these are engaged by the imagination, and the language that gets used is closer to the imagination's native tongue. Imaginative language is a key to the wonderful doorway, opening up new possibilities for the imagination. The healthy operation of either the imagination or the reason is dependent upon the other. To fail the use of reason would produce what Lewis calls in Preface to Paradise Lost a disorganized consciousness that remains at imagination forever and doesn't transfer to reason. It yields, quote, no logical thought, no morals, no mental hierarchy. For Lewis, nothing can be known apart from an act of the imagination, and that sub-rational act, when operating in a healthy way, should lead to the rational act of reason's examination. Reason is thus not a starting point or a self-feeding faculty. It operates upon what is given to it, and to attempt otherwise is to tempt the paralysis that Lewis himself experienced, beckoning what he elsewhere calls poetically the gnawing peasant reason. Lewis's dear friend Austin Farrer once summarized of Lewis's writing, saying, "We think we are listening to an argument, but in fact we are presented with a vision." and it is the vision that carries conviction. Lewis was very cognizant of the role of an apologist and what they are ultimately able to accomplish, what can be achieved in the minds and the lives of the audience. And he believed that the great merit of his own apologetic work was not so much the dissolution of opposition, but rather to help form and establish a more willing environment. He, quote, an intellectual and imaginative climate favorable to Christianity. He disagreed with those that felt that this type of approach was of no use. He employs a military metaphor, arguing that you don't disprove the validity of a particular combat unit by saying that they in particular don't win the war. It all plays a role. I remember something about sowing and watering and reaping somewhere in the Bible, I think. I can't remember. An apologist of Lewis's kind can establish in the minds of their audience a perspective that is more conducive to what ultimately may become faith in Christ. The favorable conditions under which Christianity occurs, or consideration of Christianity occurs. Lewis writes that these are evidenced when the audience's, quote, reason and imagination are not on the wrong side. To pursue apologetics in this way does not require the preliminary defeat of opposing positions. It is setting the stage, not clearing it. Thus, Lewis's self-conception as an apologist was not that he himself was effectual in arguing one into Christianity, but rather orienting one toward Christianity. And I'll close with this. The gospel is most certainly supported by reason. And the work of developing and refining precision-based rational arguments must continue. Whatever the troubles are that we have inherited from the Enlightenment, the overthrow of reason is not the solution. The work of folks that we have connected here, the Baggetts, or others too, Planting, Craig, Moreland, Groothius, etc., this should go on. However, we should not leave children behind at the temple. Okay? The revelation of the biblical God is historical, factual, and in great measure mythopoeic. Lewis mentioned the sky, and to that I would add the kingdom. The vision of reality presented to us through the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is one of a great cosmic drama where real forces of good and evil are entwined, not in some Zoroastrian ethical or corporeal dualism, but rather in a rebellion, in a mutiny that has broken out upon a truly righteous voyage. And we all must choose our actions at sea. The reality, it's better than the fiction. It is laying on the soft green hillside and seeing the blue sky through the leaves. It is the feeling of what might be as you bathe in the burning western sunset in the waning light of the day. It speaks first not to our reason, but to the deeper part of our human experience, where there are not only wounds, but there is wonder. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. So, let's give Dr. Cokenour another round of applause. I'm glad to have these kind of guys around here. I feel like I'm on the verge of feedback. Okay. As we go into our Q&A, for those of you that haven't been here before, there are QR codes dispersed throughout the tables there, the little pink cards. Scan that with your phone. You can send a question either anonymously or with your name attached to it. Around the end of the Q&A session, we will have a microphone controlled by the wonderful Molly. Say hi, Molly. And so we will, oh, thank you, Braden. So we're going to move into the Q&A portion right now. I also want to say, one second. About an hour ago, we won an award, but nobody was there to get it because we were too busy doing everything in here. We have won the most engaging organization trophy for the, yay! So afterwards, I would like our students, faculty advisor, and chapter directors to just take a picture up here while we have everything pretty and set up. No, when we're done tonight. So, yeah, so that's cool. Okay, so, right, doctor or Professor Cokenour. I cannot break myself from calling you doctor. We've been talking about your dissertation, I feel like, for...
I'm waiting on my on the answer to my PhD right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like at any point, yeah. So, hopefully soon. All right.
That's the slider on one. There we go. Okay. So, that's some weird feedback. It almost has a harmony. I've never heard that before. Yeah. So we can
Where are musicians? What key is that in?
Yeah.
Is that B flat?
It's a minor. It's definitely a minor. Okay. You said this in passing, and I wanted to give you a chance to follow up on it. And I didn't realize this about you. If this is too personal, you say like, well, we can talk about that another day. But I think you might like the opportunity to share this. You said you were at first agnostic, like Lewis.
Well, I'm actually, let me qualify that. I moved into a period of agnosticism for a time. I grew up in a divorced household, was raised by a single mother, worked multiple jobs, a couple older siblings. My mother's a believer and took me to church a lot growing up. And so I heard about Jesus, I heard about the gospel. I'm one of those guys that couldn't give you a day or an hour when I came to faith. It was a journey. But there was certainly all of those stereotypical years where I moved away. Actually, what happened was when I was 17, I had a classic crisis of faith and felt, oh, gosh, how could I know this is true?
Yeah.
And I decided, well, you have to have some sort of operating system to live on, so I'll use what I know of Christianity, which was nothing, to live on while I go about proving God for myself. And then I enrolled in college. Started as a philosophy major, read Descartes, read the Meditations, which is kind of what he does. And I thought, wow, I am really smart. Because I started doing at 17 what this world-famous philosopher did like at the end of his life, and which was a complete ruse because I didn't really try to find anything out. It's just what I told myself. And I moved into a period of agnosticism for some years then.
How many years do you think that was? Like
8.
Probably 8 years. So all the way through your
teenagers up through about halfway through my 20s.
Okay, and you got so you've worked through your undergrad. Your undergrad was in philosophy?
No. I had a 12-year bachelor's degree.
Oh, me too.
Or like
hey,
I took a semester off. Don't.
Okay.
Don't. Yeah. Learn from my mistakes. Don't take a semester off.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually took a semester off, and that's when I started working for a virtual reality company. They was paying me to play video games, so that's what happened. Original video game generation. Started with Pong.
Yeah.
So, so I was a couple of years through my bachelor's degree.
Okay. And you ended up, so you graduated with a bachelor's in?
Actually graduated with a double major in Bible and Christian leadership.
Bible and Christian leadership. You went on to do a master's degree in
Did a master's degree in theology.
In theology? Yeah. You had computer programming there at some point.
So, yeah, when I was working for the virtual reality company, it was a big company backed by Tim Disney and got bought by Microsoft. And I didn't want to live in Washington. And so the transition that happened, I went from managing these big, giant facilities to the technical side because I had learned enough technical skill. I had to manage technical people, and I didn't want to get taken advantage of. So out of self-defense, I learned those skills. And when the company changed molds, they hired me on the technical side, and then I kind of have kept that going as well.
Very good. Well,
kind of Forrest Gumpish.
So through all that, then you said probably in your mid-20s or something, you came back.
Yeah, God was drawing me back for a while, and got to a point where I had this old Bible, still do, that my mother had given my father on their wedding day. And if you come from divorced households, you know you hold on to keepsakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had this old RSV that I kept I never read it. And I had one night where, even though I'd been getting all these promotions, I was at 21, I managed a $4 million facility on the Las Vegas Strip with like 25 employees underneath me. I was the youngest guy, one of the youngest guys to corporate and all this stuff, but I wasn't making any money, and it wasn't really doing anything, and it just felt meaningless. And I wasn't despairing of life, but I felt like I was no good at life. And so I just prayed one night in downtown Chicago, God, if you are real, and if you can take my life and do something with it, let's get it on. And by the way, please give me a godly wife. That was how that prayer went. And so I began reading that old Bible, got out a notepad. I assumed it was all chronological. It's not. And and I just started writing down questions. What's the deal with Lot? What's going on? And it was just steps like that. And then eventually, when I ended up in Houston after the company was sold, because my brother was here, or is here, got connected to some theological education and started studying the Bible.
Very cool. Very cool. So, you were talking a lot tonight about apologetics and the use of imagination, reason, the combination of the two. I couldn't help but think, while you were talking about William Lane Craig, I couldn't help but think of Hilbert's Hotel. I'm sure you're familiar with that. He throws that in the middle of the cosmological argument. Things, and these little imaginative things. I wanted to get like a really good definition of imaginative apologetics and how we can incorporate that as young apologists, like in our thinking.
Well, you're talking to a guy who just wrote a PhD on ambiguity. So,
we're getting there next.
Yeah, we're getting there next. So I wouldn't. I honestly would not give a concrete definition to imagination, because its very nature is so immensely flexible. And I think imaginative apologetics is not merely words that are spoken, it's images that are used, it's conduct, it's the whole breadth of artistic things, not merely in purely artistic environments, but incorporated in other ways. And I think that it's limited only by God's own leading in the individual. So what I'm interested in doing is drawing attention to the importance of the imagination as a faculty in apprehending reality and in apprehending truth, and in the importance of what it does when we engage a person's imagination in the process of communicating about the God that we love. And I've just seen that work in so many different ways in my preaching, on the street with people, in relationships. So I think imaginative apologetics is one that, through a broad scope of means, endeavors to engage an individual's imagination, perhaps up front when you're addressing things about Christ. So it's more of a methodology, I guess, than a definition.
So tonight you went through Lewis's two different hemispheres of how he works through things, both reason and imagination. This anonymous question from the crowd. For you personally, which of Lewis's characters are the richest example of each hemisphere, and why?
Which of, like, his fiction characters? Or, I'm not sure.
Well, they didn't qualify characters, so I'm guessing fiction characters.
So read it again, sorry.
Sure. For you personally, which of Lewis's characters are the richest example of each hemisphere, both reason and imagination, and why?
That's a really interesting question. I have not thought of that.
It is. It's not really a question you can fail to answer. I mean,
no, it's not. This isn't a character, it's a place. Imagination, for me, is best encapsulated in the wood between the worlds in The Magician's Nephew. And I just find it's endlessly captivating for me, that whole concept and what transpires there. And so for me, the wood between the worlds would best encapsulate imagination. And then, off the top of my head, and I think probably Fox from Until We Have Faces would encapsulate reason. Yeah.
So I think the wood between the worlds is pretty self-explanatory, but they said, and why? So why Fox? Why do you think Fox?
Because it's really who he is. I mean, he's the Greek who's brought over, who's, working there, and he's essentially this Stoic philosopher, and this is how he has conducted his education. And he's not the most flattering, I don't want to come across as anti-philosophy or anything like that at all. He's not the most flattering representation of that, but there is that as I was doing in the talk, that juxtaposition of the fox and the priest. And so I think just the nature of his very character is very rational in how he approaches things. Yeah.
Very good. So, do you believe, this is another question from the crowd, this they left their name, it is Popcorn. So whoever Popcorn. I actually know a guy named Popcorn back home. True story. You want to find some weird names, come to Eastern Kentucky. I don't know.
That's a good question.
Maybe.
I immediately want to hang out with that guy.
He was a mechanic. Yeah,
of course he's a mechanic.
Yeah. Why not? So Popcorn asks, do you believe imagination and rationalizing imagination can corrupt and pervert the truth?
Oh, sure. I think all manner of things can corrupt and pervert the truth. I wouldn't believe it in an absolute sense. I mean, certainly not from the talk. These things are more art than science.
Mm-hmm.
They're more art than science, and so as with anything we do, we must do it in good conscience, in community, and in reflection, and with a good measure of humility, recognizing that we always, never assuming we have all of our theology absolutely correct, always ready to be adjusting. And so, I think it certainly could. And I think we've seen that even in contemporary culture over the last 20 years, people who have really leaned into different imaginative things that have eventually gone awry theologically. I don't know that would be, depending on the different instances, I don't know that would be because of the imagination. But it's possible.
Very good. And guys, be sure, also we're going to have a open mic Q&A here in just a moment. So scan your QR code, get your questions in if you haven't yet. I like what you said about establishing the environment, not really winning the battle. I caught that near the end, and I think there's a whole lot of truth to that. I think with apologetics, we tend to think it's about winning the battle, when really it's about getting people for me and for many apologists I've read, it's about getting people to use the mind that God has given them. It's not you're not necessarily going out there to convert somebody. I heard one famous apologist say it like this. He said, if you're asking how many conversions an apologist had at a meeting, you're asking the wrong question. What you should be asking is how many people were this far away from God when they walked in that are now this far away from God when they're walking out, using their mind to get closer to God. And even in your own conversion, it seems like it was more of a rational discovery over time, that you kind of just, it took time, which is what made the foundation so deep, I would assume. So I like this idea of creating the environment, not exactly winning the battle. If you want to elaborate on that just a little bit more, like what could we do as a group that goes out, well, we're going out tomorrow. By the way, if anybody wants to come with us and do some evangelism at U of H, you're welcome to come. We're going out tomorrow to the University of Houston over here, and that's what we're doing, is creating the environment. That's what we do every week here on this campus. That's what I hope we're doing, is creating the environment.
I brought the University of Houston to you. It's my niece. She's an alum there.
Oh,
but she's
cool.
already a Christian, so.
Okay. All right. Work's already done. So what can we do, and what did C.S. Lewis do to create the environment, you think, in like a deeper way? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Okay. So I'll take the latter first. So Lewis, I think, does this certainly with a mountain of analogies and metaphors, just voluminous. I mean, if you sit down with any of his works and try to sort of, I'm just going to take note of every time he employs, an analogy or a metaphor, symbol. It just is, it's catalogs of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so he just keeps working with it, and seems always ready to let it go. Like he never seems like he's trying to push the metaphor too far, right? Like all these things are all windows into the truth that fall apart if you push them too much. And so he's always trying to work with that to find it. one of the biggest things, and so in doing that when you're using metaphors, it helps people to see things from another angle. I like to think of it this way, to use a metaphor. If we're all looking, if you're looking at a mountain, we're all gazing at the same mountain, particular idea, concept, whatever. I'm not saying this is the mountain of God and all paths lead to God. I'm not doing that. It's just a mountain of an idea thing. And from where you stand, you have a particular vantage. But a person you are dealing with is not seeing it. They are on a different part of the mountain looking at the same peak, or trying to. Or maybe it's another peak that's closer to them, and it's cast the larger peak in shadow. And so what these metaphors of Lewis does is it helps people to kind of conceptualize things in a different way. It lets the imagination, gives a playground to the imagination. And this is, I didn't get into this, but this is one of the things I think that really makes Lewis so beloved, is in doing this, it changes the environment of an apologist to where I'm not drawing a line in the sand and now let's go. We're not doing that. Rather, it's Lewis coming along like this and saying, I'm going to go over there. Come on.
Yeah.
And he becomes the tour guide. He becomes a guide on an apologetic journey rather than a combatant. And this produces in Lewis, or with Lewis, a sense of companionship and relationship. This is why people feel like they really know Lewis, because they're journeying with him. It's this posthumous, envisioned relationship. I had that very same feeling for a long time, till I got to know him more, and then I don't know if we would be friends or not. I think we would be in certain ways. So that's one thing. In terms of my own experience, I think one of the biggest things of creating and so that alone changes the environment because it's not so combative, and people can start to relax. The other thing is, if you are going to speak to someone who is seeing the mountain from another place, you have to be willing to walk around and look at where they're looking from. Oh, I didn't realize you had this light shining in your eyes. Or this branch. That's why, because here, I'll tell you what, I've talked to people from all different slices of Christianity, all sorts of different stripes of agnostics and atheists, and all sorts of different faith backgrounds in multiple places in the world. And I tell you what, Bill, I've never met a person who believes what they believe because they think it's ridiculous.
That's true. I mean, that's true.
You might think it is. It might sound crazy. Yeah. But there is something about how they're looking at things that from their vantage point, it makes sense. As Pascal said, right? All men do their own interests, even those that hang themselves. There's part of that where it makes sense. Now, it may not actually be rational or and if I can get around to that angle, now I can say, look. Let's move that. Look. Oh, wow,
Yeah. I've often said that there's good reason why people believe in something. I just finished my thesis on Islam. There's probably good reason why almost 2 billion people in the world believe in Islam. Like, it's not something we can just write off.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing, and I'll end with this, the other thing that happens is this. When you do this, if you do it genuinely, not just mechanistically, if you do it genuinely, or I'll say it, I try to do it because I actually really value the other person.
Yeah.
I'm not better than anyone. I know myself very well.
Yeah.
And my capacity for evil is not outmatched by anyone. And so I really value this. And this other person, they are equally valuable to my Father as I am.
Yeah.
And when I try to do this, they feel that you actually care, that you actually value them. And when you give, as my good friend who led Jews for Jesus in Budapest, I met with him to ask about talking with Jewish folks about the faith. And he said, Terry, just listen to them.
Yeah.
And they will give you a hearing. And I was like, I'm so smart, So this is really caring for people, And so,
It's so true. If you just give time to listen to somebody, hear them out, you may totally disagree with them. Just to qualify, like, just wrote a thesis on Islam. That means that there's a lot of things about Islam I really don't agree with. It's kind of surprising too, like some of the things you find in there that you can't agree with. And I've found most of those things not by rigorous study and mining the depths of the surahs and not surahs, but the hadith and the different Quranic, texts and analyzing all the, all the different scholars and their work. I mean, that came later, but a lot of my ideas that went in that thesis just came from having 4-hour conversations with people over coffee. And they'll start saying things, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, whoa. Is that a popular doctrine in Islam? Oh, yeah, everybody was like, really? Yeah, you just sit and listen.
Well, and you get to deal with,
Yeah.
you could use any particular belief or ideology, but you're not dealing with Islam, you're dealing with the person
You're dealing with
and
people.
their Islam.
Yeah.
And that sometimes is a different thing.
Something we say a lot in here is we're answering people, not necessarily questions. And we have to always remember
That's great. That's really beautiful.
It's always. So now we have a question from Unpopped Popcorn. We're keeping this going tonight. When do we know that imagination has perverted the truth?
When do we know that?
When do we know that?
When do we know that imagination?
In
has
your
perverted
opinion,
the truth?
when do we know?
Well, if we're speaking strictly in Lewis's understanding, the reason would be the check on that. Imagination would, in a sort of sub-rational, impulsive way, would draw forward something we think means a certain way, and then the action of reason upon that would then allow us to see that it is meaning falsely or erroneously. So if we're speaking strictly in terms of how Lewis would look at it, that's what would happen, a healthy reason. And I would add to that, this is where doing following Christ in community is quite important, right? Because I can be wrong. My reason may not be operating healthy, and I may need a brother to say, that sounds a little kooky dukes. Let's talk about something. So I think that's one big thing. There's a lot of ways that you could discover that. But again, I think the importance of doing theology, doing ministry, doing life together, as dear Bonhoeffer says, is immensely important, because we can get it wrong on our own. And our own mental faculties may not be the check that we need them to be. But Christ and the other likely will.
Yeah. I like Lewis's quote. I paraphrase, I don't remember the exact quote. He said, I really didn't become liberal-minded, and of course that's got a lot of packing right now, but he said, I really didn't become liberal-minded until I became a Christian. What he meant was he couldn't really think outside the box until he became a Christian. And I think that's what he means by imagination, is that Christianity is not necessarily opposed to every worldview, but Christianity can affirm the truths that you find in every worldview, because I don't believe a worldview can have staying power unless there's some truth in it somewhere that allows it, which,
if
to be fair,
it's going to be in
twisted.
the open exchange of ideas.
Yeah. And that truth can be twisted. It's not the full story, but I think it was C.S. Lewis that said Christianity is the whole story.
Yeah, in that quote too, he says when he was an atheist, when I was an atheist, I had to believe that the vast majority, the thing that was dearest to the vast majority of people throughout history, all the different faiths, right, was nonsense. And he said, but when I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal approach. Right, and which is exactly right. And then he goes on to say, we should expect to find things like pagan Christs and other. It would be if there is a God who is the uncreated creator, the uncaused cause and sustainer of all things, who brings this into existence and who reveals himself into it, should we not find echoes of the original pebble dropped?
Yeah.
Of course we should. It would be so odd not to.
Yep.
And so, and that's one of the things that really endeared me to Lewis when I started reading more of him, was, oh, wait a second, I don't have to be quite so fundamentalist and just outright reject all of every other faith. I can sort of get the meat and leave the bones and see these different things. And that takes skill and maturity, right?
Yeah,
You don't just go wantonly, but
Yeah, for sure. And if you're looking for a biblical example of that, I think probably Paul's greatest sermon is found in Acts 17, how he does that. As far as imagination goes, how he was able to pull from all these different... Yeah. So follow up to that, and then we'll move on. If the imagination of Lewis allowed him to rationalize and explore the faith, does that not personalize faith? So is there some subjectivity to imagination? That's what's being asked here. And singularized belief to those who believe and deny others.
Say the second part.
and singularize, I'd say subjectivize, belief to those who believe and deny others.
So I think, well, there's a little misreading there. Lewis isn't rationalizing the faith. He sees his imagination engaging any sense of meaning, and then the reason being the determinant of what means truly or what means falsely, which would be different from a rationalization. I think that at the heart of the question, though, which is a good question, is can this become subjective and individualized and all of that? And I would say with or without employing the imagination, that can happen. I've served with people and been around quite fundamentalist Christian environments that would reject any concept of employing imaginative approaches whatsoever, and things are utterly rational and quite rigid, and some wonderful people too, but where there was an immensely individualized conceptions even within that. And so the imagination's, leaning into the reality of imagination's role doesn't push that one way or another. I think that has to do with how the individual is working with that. Again, more art than science. And the guardrail of that is a healthy reason. A healthy reason is informed by Scripture and good community and all of these other facets. So it's done well, it really needs to be a holistic thing.
Yeah.
Which is what people are yearning for, but not what many of us are living in the current state of things.
Probably good reason why some of the most influential Christian works have been imaginative works, have been fictional works, like Pilgrim's Progress, Lord of the Rings.
I was listening to a podcast
Chronicles
the
of
other
Narnia,
day. Oh gosh, what was his name? He's a Bart scholar, and Bart's not going to be the most endearing to imaginative approaches. And the question was asked of him, if you could talk to any sort of influential figure, not necessarily just Jesus right out of the bat, but living or dead, and he said C.S. Lewis was his answer, because it grabs us. It grabs more of who we are.
Yeah, so good segue into this question. This was asked earlier. Should we get better at comprehending story or get better at translating story and art into argument? Do you see, do we need to do better at that? Are we getting better at that?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
And myself included. I need to get better at that. I'm a lover of stories, and I'm always trying to get better. And I have 3 brilliant daughters who are constantly keeping me in check, and so yes, I think we do. I think I'm for both. I love great, well-reasoned arguments, and they are deeply meaningful to me. Many of them are very, very important to my faith. But this piece of bringing in the imagination, I think probably just personally, I may be so much impassioned about this because it's been so, what's the word I'm looking for, Jenga? It's been so weak, malnourished for so long. And I've been so nourishing this other area, and now I just feel like I've come upon the oasis. I'm like, oh gosh, I want to drink from this because it's balancing me out. And so, yeah, I really think we do, but not losing the other, right? I'm not going against the other, more analytic approaches, but we got to find a way to marry these things. And this looks different for different people. That's why I'm avoiding a particular definition or one of the great errors in Christendom is mimicry. This works well over there, so we'll just do the same thing and surely we'll get the same result. It's we do it over and over and over again, rather than looking and saying, well, wait, and this is what got me started studying Lewis academically was, well, wait a minute, I don't want to imitate him, but he's results of his writings are so incredible. Aren't there some principles or something here that can be adapted to whatever context? And I think this is one of them.
We have a question from our YouTube live audience. Then do we have a question over here? Okay, let's take care of this YouTube question. It'll probably be a quick one. Then we'll let that be our closing question over here. Okay, so this is Molly from YouTube. Thank you for
Hi, Molly.
Hello. Oh, different Molly? Not this Molly. Molly from out in YouTube land. Okay, using reason. She asks, using reason to keep our imagination in check. At times, our reasoning can be wrong. At what point do our wrong reasoning and beliefs become heresy and not just working through a question?
Well, I think when we accept and adopt a view that is established as heterodoxy. So I think the process is important, and it's a great question that she asked, because I think we do move into areas of heterodoxy and heresy at different times, processing these things, and we need to have freedom to do that. That's a different matter than saying, I now believe this heterodoxy and I'm going to proclaim it as gospel. That's a different matter. We're not very good as Christians at giving each other freedom to be wrong about things and working through it. And so I'm not advocating that we don't be careful about and clear about things that are heresy. We absolutely need to do that. I mean, the Christianity begins within all the earliest Christian writings are markedly apologetic. It's not until the Edict of Milan, when things start to settle down, that we get more real theological discourse. So this work of having to combat, and every generation of Christianity has to redo this, even in cultures like here where it's existed for a long time. So we have to be clear about things that are heretical and heterodox, but we can do better about, in maturity, in-house, right, Lewis's metaphor, in-house, working through these things, and if we start to meander, or we see someone else who's meandering on the borders of things, sort of bring them back in. I like the metaphor of a playground. You take kids out to a playground, there's the slides and the swing set and the sandbox, and go have at it. There's a cat running across, go have a blast. But there's a road out there, and if you run in it, it's going to end badly. So you got to stop there. But have all kinds of fun inside the playground. And so, again, it's not a straightforward answer. Keep going back to it. It comes to evaluating our own thinking, doing it in community, making our own selves responsible to others, not saying someone else make me accountable, making your own self responsible to engage with others, and finding someone that is trustworthy, mature, and safe to bat these ideas around. These are the conversations I live for. I don't want to hear about sports. I just don't care. Not that I don't like sports, but when someone says, I've been thinking about this, and I wonder, you got me. I'm there. That's the stuff of life, and giving room to do that. And you get some really great friendships along the way. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree. Question from the audience, the in-house audience. State your name for the record. Everything you can say will be used against you immediately.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Howdy.
Howdy.
Howdy. We good? We good? Okay, we're good. I'm Joel.
Hi, Joel.
So, I have a kind of a strange question. Is there something unique about Christian imaginative works that make them better than non-Christian imaginative works?
I want to ask you to quantify better, but if you mean in terms of their literary skill and capacity to captivate someone, no. Maybe that's controversial. I think that I agree with Tolkien, as sub-creators, even those who have not embraced Christ have the capacity for immense imaginative expression. And I think we all probably know that through different books and things that have nothing to do with, maybe even attacking Christianity, that are just unbelievably compelling in the stories they tell. On another sense, because if Christian imaginative works are speaking to ultimate reality, in that sense, I think yes, they can be better because they can tell a better story. In that sense, they can tell a more holistic tale. They can speak and tie things together to where everything doesn't just become the anti-hero. We go back to heroes that are really worth wanting to be like, or a hero that we really want to be like. And in that way, I would say they can be.
It seemed like even the best fictional works seem to have those archetypes embedded in them somewhere.
They kind of tell the story anyway, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we had Nancy Christi last week talking about Schaefer, and the thing, when I started reading Schaefer, I've never gone back and found it, so I hope it's true, but I thought I remembered reading something about him, students coming up and him dialoguing with them through Led Zeppelin lyrics. And I thought, and showing how these are pointing to spiritual truths. So, that's my kind of guy. You know?
Yeah. All right. Well, that concludes tonight. Thank you, guys. I would ask we give another round of applause for Dr. Cokenour. And if our leadership team would come up here and take a picture. You know what? Anybody who would want to, just come up here and take a picture with us. Especially our leadership team. I'd like to take a picture with this trophy. Just for the good people. Yeah. And thank you guys we want to award something about engaging students, and thank you to all students that we engage with on a weekly basis that made that possible. So thank you, guys.